Here.
Mr. Rickes?
Here.
Ms. Garrison?
Here. So then moving to the minutes, do we have a motion to approve the minutes of the October 5th, 2015 Board Finance Committee meeting that was in your packet?
So moved.
Second. Okay.
Ms. Chow?
Yes.
Mr. Rickes?
Yes.
Ms. Garrison?
Yes. And just related to that, I wanted to thank Faye. We had talked about calling out kind of issues for questions for follow-up, and she did that at the end of the minutes, so folks can look to that. And I think we've actually made follow-up actions on almost all of those. So thank you for doing that, Faye. It's very helpful. So we have a couple action items tonight, and then 2 discussion items. We're going to start with the item related to financial audit, which there's a shift that Paul's going to talk to you about in terms of when we accept the audit.
Yeah, thank you, Candace. What I'm going to recommend, given the conversation that we're going to have later on this evening around budget and the tax levy, that we postpone the formal presentation of the budget, the formal presentation of the audit until our November 16th meeting. At that time, the auditors will be here, be able to present the materials that are within the packet, and of course answer questions and concerns. So it's just a postponing until November 16th, and we can bring it to the full board for consideration and for voting.
Okay.
And decision.
So we will then have a few more weeks to
Indeed.
very tediously go through the audit materials and have any questions prepared. And certainly if there are some questions that are more factual nature, Mary always welcomes those in advance if you'd like to get that information as well. We'll have some more time to do that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, then let's move to the next point of business, which is the Head Start transportation contract.
Hi. Since District 65 has been awarded the grant, and we are now the fiscal agents of this grant, we have to be paying for the transportation services ourselves. And that is what led us to the requirement to bid this service, since it is one that falls under the bidding requirements. So we put the service out for bid, and we did get one bid back from Jules Transportation Company. They have been providing the service last year and into the start of this year, and they've been providing very good service for that program. And so we are comfortable recommending that bid. It's a 3-year contract, and it is at the stated price where we started out the year. So it's right in line with our estimates. Happy to take questions.
Sure. Does anyone have questions?
Just a couple.
Or Richard?
With our existing busing contract, there's no conflict in having this additional provider?
There's not. In fact, this is a public bid. We advertised in the papers. Any company was welcome to pick up bid specs and submit a bid, and we only did receive one sealed bid. So I think the other contractors may have been booked for the year after the year started, but we certainly would have entertained a bid from them, but we only received this one bid from Jules.
And if we see that their service is better than our other provider, do we have an opportunity to pursue expanding services with this provider?
I did inquire, but unfortunately, this Jules company is a very small company. They're located on the south side of Chicago, and they are too small to handle our entire service. I did have that conversation with them earlier on in the year.
And do we look at our standard busing arrangement as an all or none? Like, are we contracted that it has to be an all or none? Or I'm just trying to think as a leverage point with our primary provider of transportation, if this could end up, giving us a little bit more ability to get them to deliver more effectively.
Well, we are in the start of a 3-year bid contract with our current provider, Positive Connections. So we bid that service, and this is a 3-year agreement with this company. We can certainly see if routes come up and one company can't provide a bus, could the other company, stand in and provide a bus? But I did check with Jules, and they're not large enough to pick up our entire service. But as we bid and rebid our transportation services in this past year, trying to get, interest from other companies and reasonable bids, we did end up dividing our service, I believe, 4 different ways. We were willing to accept bids for north or south side regular or special service transportation. So we were willing to go with up to 4 providers, and we only did receive 1 complete bid, I'm talking about for the other service, and that was from Positive Connections. So that's where we are at this point. And as we can see in the attached memo, our service with them has gotten a little better in the month of October.
And I know I raised that because we've talked about the lack of competition sometimes as one of the factors that impacts our ability to perhaps increase the quality of service and keep our costs low, which is why I was asking.
Mary, is there a reason that with Positive Connections, we have a 3-year contract?
It's typical when you bid transportation services that it is for a 3-year term. And we have cost renewals built into that 3-year, limited to the CPI. So that's to our advantage. If we were going out for bid every year, we could see larger increases from year to year.
That's true.
Because that's when we got, obviously, the large increase this past year was because we
Right.
went to bid.
Of course, that might be a disincentive to improving service. Because they know they have the business for 3 years.
Well, there's always, contractual terms in which you can,
Mm-hmm.
if they're not meeting the actual
Yeah.
requirements of the contract, you can.
But the point of departure is where Richard is putting on the table, is to hopefully get competitive bids so that we can find the best provider at the most economical price.
Oh,
Right.
truly, but now we can't do that for another 3 years, right?
In terms of bidding, correct. In terms of pushing for service and service quality, I think we can do that all the time. And indeed, from what I know, we've been rather pleased with the Jewel service.
Yes, yes.
And it's interesting because Jewel, the company, is located not only on the south side, but the far south side. They're at 111th Street, way on the south side.
Where do they keep their buses?
I believe I'm assuming that their terminal is located on the south side because I'm not aware of any local terminal, which was a problem we heard from other bidders, that there aren't local terminals for rent in this area. So they drive a long way to service our kids for the Head Start program.
Are there other questions about the Jewel, or this bid specifically? I just had one. Have the fees changed? Have they changed materially from the bid that they're giving to what was being paid?
I
through the
think,
service
I believe this
previously?
is in line with the cost estimates going into this year. I don't know what they charged last year, I'm not sure.
Okay. Then, hearing no more questions, we take questions at the end of every discussion item, so if there's any public comment related to this item, no, okay. Then the Board Finance Committee recommends that the Head Start transportation contract be presented to the full board on November 16th, 2015. Do we have to second?
Second.
Roll call.
Roll call. No.
Ms. Chow?
Yes.
Mr. Rikus?
Yes.
Ms. Garrison?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. The next action item relates to the King Arts track, and it's a bid rejection. So, Mary, if you can just summarize kind of the background and context for this.
So the King Arts parents had done some fundraising through the years and had a cash balance on hand, and they recently decided they would like to add a walking track like we have at Orrington and at Haven. And they had a dollar amount set aside for that. And when the district put bids out, the bids came in line with where our architect expected the cost to be, but it was higher than where the King Arts parents were expecting it to be. They had a contractor provide them a lower quote, but unfortunately it was for a track that was not designed to current bid requirements that require more of a depth of a base so that the track would hold up from year to year. So I did speak with Dr. Jeff Brown, the principal, and also members of the King Arts PTA, and what they would like to see is these bids that were opened back in July be rejected at this point, and if the parents decide to go forward with this project, we can always rebid it in the future. And the King Arts parents were also interested in their contractor providing a bid, and he did not have enough time to respond to this bid request dating back to July. So that kind of brings us to why we're here today. But I just wanted to review the process. Anytime parents or other entities have donations, donations do need to be accepted by the Board of Education as a matter of process, and smaller projects like this have been accepted in the past. Again, we have similar tracks at Orrington and at Haven, and that's what the King Arts parents were interested in bringing forward at King Arts. But again, the process is that donations would come to the Board of Ed to make sure it's something the board would support, before going ahead with approval on these sorts of things.
So in this case, the board didn't previously receive the gift, has not received a gift.
That's correct, because the prices came in higher than the parents were anticipating, so it's not going forward at this point.
Did the parents raise anything close to what these bids are?
I think they were anticipating something closer to $35,000 range. Again, the contractor who thought he could provide a track the track was not designed to the current spec requirements for that sort of a track. So that would not have held up, even through the year with the weather and the plowing and such that needs to be done. So we can always go out for bid should that be something the board is willing to accept and the parents willing to fund down the road.
Just a quick question. Something that was raised, I think, after the Haven track was put in was just the size of the track, and that it wasn't scoped to be big enough for competitive purposes. I'm just curious if the King Arts one was closer to Haven, or if it was actually able to be, or they're thinking that it would be able to be used in competition if they do it at some point.
I don't know the answer to that. I will look into it. I don't know if it's bigger or smaller than the one at Haven. I don't know that it was contemplated as a competition track, but just for convenience for public and student use. But I can look into that and let you know.
And the only reason I raise it is, competition, I think more at the middle school level, that they have, some track and field events, and I don't know what our demand is for, competition sized tracks in Evanston, but just a thought.
One other thing that Mary underscores is that when we get an offer like this and we have to contemplate it before we bring it forward to the board, we do have to engage the site improvement architect, and that's at a cost to us, but to make sure that it's up to spec and that it will maintain its life, and that we also won't have the ongoing costs over time. So that's an obligation that we have as we take on any project through the generosity of parents or PTA or the community.
Any other questions?
So the parents, it was more the former than the latter, where there was.
Could you come, Andrea, I'm sorry, but could you come to a mic just so everyone out at TV land can hear your words?
Thank you. So I think the parents got ahead of themselves and were hoping that it could be a competition track because King Arts has the space. It probably could be a quarter-mile track.
Right.
The Haven does not have the space. But they got ahead of themselves and started talking to contractors, and then we had to kind of talk to our partners, the district, and I think that's when, the requirements became apparent. And so I think if they go out again, they'd like it to be, because part of the purpose was it could be an asset for the community, and there was a clear need, especially since we have middle school students there. So I think that's what we'll do. The question is whether, when the final price tag comes in of a competition level, whether it's quarter mile or whatever they race on, it may just look out of sight. So we'll have to figure out whether an accommodation would be made, and then it would just be recreational.
Thanks.
Yep.
Yeah.
So you don't have to make a call, Mary.
And anytime we do have site improvement projects or building construction projects or any type of project that would change the outside of the building, there is a new requirement per a lawsuit that came from a neighboring district, where school districts now have to also comply with city building codes. And we generally do inform the city when we have projects. Don Stevenson and I actually have a meeting this week with the new person at Evanston. We're going to be just reviewing the sorts of things we're planning this summer, which mainly is roof work, so not changing the outside of a structure. But we do need to keep the city in the loop, and anything where we're adding hard space, such as a track or a parking lot or any other type of alteration, that could involve stormwater management issues, which could add to the cost of a project. So just something else to keep in mind.
And because of that lawsuit, we were given a formal statement to say that we must engage with our colleagues at the city, which we do anyway.
Yes.
But that's even more formal now.
Yes, yes, and I think our meeting is this week.
Okay, thank you, Mary. So the final action item is the truth in text.
Do we have to vote on,
Yes, you do.
Oh,
need to
yes,
vote
I'm
because
sorry.
It's a rejection.
I'll make a motion then.
Things along.
I move that we reject all the bids at this time, and that in the future, if funding becomes available, we rebid it. King Arts Track.
Second.
Ms. Chow?
Yes,
Mr. Ricketts?
Yes.
Ms. Garrison?
Yes.
thank you. Now we can move to the truth in taxation resolution, which is item 6. And
I'm just going to walk through some of the slides that are included in the packet. I'll reference the slide number and the packet page number. This is the 2015 tax levy that we will be filing at the end of this year. We present the tentative tax levy in November. The final tax levy is brought to the board in December, and then it's filed with the county clerk before the end of December. I hand carry that down to make sure it gets there. Our tax revenues are our largest revenue source and also the most stable. We have also seen an increase in our collection rate, which is good news. So we have changed our assumption in budgeting and our financial projections to reflect a 98.5% collection rate. We had seen collection rates dip as low as 97.5% in prior years. So that's good news overall. On slide number 4, which is packet page number 138, you can see a history of the district property values. When we received our final 2014 levy information, it was the first year in 5 where we had an increase in our property values. So that's a sign that our property values are starting to come back ever so slowly. We had 4 years of declining EAVs prior to that. And because we are subject to the tax cap, when our property values fall, it pushes up the tax rate. And you'll see that on the following slide number 6 that depicts our tax rate history. With the last levy year, we did have 16.5 million of new property. That was a high number for us. It did include a small TIF that rolled off and added to our tax levy. The limiting tax rates are shown on slide 5. We cannot exceed a limiting tax rate in any of the funds where we have a limiting rate. And again, as you can see on slide 6, the history of our tax rate by fund. We are still fortunate to have a large property tax base in Evanston, so we are not pushing up against limiting rates. And our ed fund is the largest fund, so we can look at that rate on the next slide. There are districts with less property values that are pushing up against limiting rates, and that means they're limited by what they can levy into these funds. So thankfully, that has not happened despite the 4 years of declining EAVs. We are starting to see them coming back up. So slide 6, which is packet page 140, shows the history of the tax rates. And if you just follow the ed fund line, again, the limiting rate is 3.5. We were hitting slightly below a 2% rate in those funds until we started to see property values decline, and then we saw a higher rate as a result of that inverse declining property value. So we are not close to the 3.5% in that ed fund or the limiting rate in any of our other limited funds. Slide number 7, which is packet page 141, shows our tax levy extension history. You can see that in the CPI column, we have gone from the highest CPI since tax caps of 4.10 down to the lowest CPI since tax cap history in 2009 levy year of 0.1. And sadly, we are in a 3-year decline on CPI factors. The CPI for this levy that we're filing this year is 0.8. And I do apologize, there's a typo in that very last column number under CPI. It should be 0.8 as well on the realistic levy estimate. Because we are not sure where our new property will fall, we always levy a higher amount because the clerk will always reduce our levy request to the tax cap limit, but they will never increase the levy request. So if you look at slide 7, packet page 141, our high estimate, which is the levy we're filing, the aggregate levy is $90.5 million, which is a 5.44% increase. That is way above where we're likely to come in with the CPI factor of 0.8. With new property added in, the realistic aggregate tax levy increase is 1.11%. Again, that's a realistic increase on our aggregate levy over the prior levy year. So Dr. Gorin is going to be speaking later about our budget history, and you can certainly see with our largest revenue source limited to a maximum of 1.11%, when other expenses are exceeding that, it's not hard to see why we're facing budget deficits going forward. The levy by fund, shown on slide 8, packet page 142, shows the levy numbers that we are requesting by fund. We always inflate the education fund amount. So again, this levy is inflated by approximately $4 million. So that ed fund number is more likely to come in at the $72 million amount. And that the clerk will reduce that number once that final extension is known in the fall of 2016. You can see on slide 9, packet page 143, our history of tax refunds. As refunds are tax objections are sought in the courts and awarded, this is amounts that we lose from our whopping tax cap increase. And we've been a little under $2 million in most of these previous years. I do show the mathematical formulas in case anybody wants to follow through. You just need a calculator that we'll go to about 10 digits and you can come up with the same numbers. So the high levy request, again, is a little over 90 million. That's the aggregate request. And the aggregate is a fancy word for everything in the tax levy except the bond and interest. The bond and interest is a separate levy amount. The clerk actually knows what we need to pay in annual bond payments, and so they extend that amount separate from the aggregate levy. And I also do show the bond and interest amounts in our request here. So again, the clerk will always reduce the levy request. We're asking for above a 5% increase. We know the more realistic increase will be just above 1%. But because our ask is above 5%, we are required to provide a truth in taxation notice to our taxpayers, which goes into the newspapers, and we will have a truth in taxation hearing in December before the board votes on the final tax levy, and then we can take any questions or comments from the public at that time before the board would vote on the final tax levy. I'm not anticipating any changes to the request, but should something come up, we will publicly discuss any levy numbers that we would change before the final vote in December. And this is in line with what we've done in previous years. Again, we're asking for a high amount, knowing the clerk will reduce it to the tax cap limit. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Great. Do we have any questions?
I'll just
be the bearer of bad news. No.
What?
So I guess I feel like I asked this last year, and I'm going to ask it again this year, that this document is fabulous, tons of information, but I don't know if anyone other than you really knows it really well. And is there a way that we can sort of create something that makes it easy for the everyday resident to understand, you know, the tax levy, the increase, how it affects them? So, and I'm thinking just a one-page summary, maybe 1.5 pages, front and back, just something that I feel like we go through this, you go through all these numbers, you explain the calculation, but the person living right there is going to say, who cares? So how can we create something that can really educate people about this? And I know the other document that we'll look at, I feel like there could have been, like if you look at that document and then you look at this document, and that's too much information too, but I feel like it's at least presented in a format that makes people want to figure out what's going on.
The other document being what?
The
audit document?
The budget planning update.
Oh, the budget, yeah. So I think that's a great question, but I think we probably should, it requires us to think about what do people need to know from this, which is perhaps slightly different than the information is presented here. It seems like people need to know how the CPI and how the tax levy affects them and their tax bill. Like that seems, to me, as a taxpayer, that's kind of what I would want to understand, which is slightly different than what this does. Is that what you're getting at, though?
Yeah, I feel like there's something missing. Like we go through this, we see this is fine, but there's something missing in how we communicate this to everyone else. And I think you sort of hit on in one of the emails, like, do we need to, I don't know if we need to have like budget hearings around the city or whatever, but somehow create something that allows simplest, I mean, I'm trying to simplify it.
I can certainly work with Melissa on coming up with a document that we might be able to put on our website, you know, FAQs related to the tax levy, something like that, perhaps, that might
I just know during the strategic
be more
planning, we
user-friendly.
talked about this, the budget, the finance group, we talked about the fact that we give out a lot of information. People see it all, but no one really is grasping it, partly because I just think it's not in a format that's easy to read, understand, and simplify.
So I think we made a lot of progress on budget at a glance. And
Yes.
so that's step one. And
Yes.
I think it's an interesting thing to take what you're asking and Candace's point and sort of think about how to frame the question and then provide information in an understandable format. Marie and I were actually this afternoon looking at a school district in Arizona, was that right? That has a video presentation has an animated figure. It's a little cutesy, but it actually communicates very clearly what the different buckets of resources are. And again, would we use that here? We'd have to really figure out what the questions are. But we could pursue, I think we have to do two things. We still have to present the information as we present it, and juxtapose that with what might be translatable or understandable information. That's all.
And I don't expect you to do it by December. I'm just throwing it out there.
Right.
I'm just letting you know that I think something, the budget at the glance was a good idea, but you know, we talk about this and I see this every year and it's,
Great. Thank you, Omar. Meg, did I see? No? Does anybody else have questions about the resolution? Okay. So if there are no other questions or comments, yeah, I'll read. The Board Finance Committee recommends that the Truth in Taxation tax levy be presented to the full board on November 16th, 2015.
A second? Ms. Chow?
Yes?
Mr. Rigas?
Yes.
Yes.
I feel like we need to get up and do some jumping jacks. The level of energy in this room is just palpable.
Can I just add one more thing based on Omar's question? I don't want
Yes.
to get lost in the technical language, the shifting of the consumer price index from the earliest year to where it is now. And the 0.8 is very low, and indeed, as we'll talk in a few minutes, it may be going lower.
Correct.
And that's a determinant of our extra revenues for the district.
Right, and yet again, the tax levy, it is our largest revenue source, like close to 80% of our revenues, and they're limited by tax caps, which limit us to 5% or the CPI, whichever is less. And as Dr. Gorin stated, and you can see in the presentation, the CPI has gone down, 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 and it has slipped yet again this calendar year, and we'll talk about that shortly.
All right, so we have 2 discussion items. I think the first should be pretty brief, because this is, the transportation update memo that you have is really a follow-on to last month's information. So maybe we could focus on anything new in this report and take any questions. I did note, and the only thing I noted that was new was a postponement of the app. So if you could cover that, and then we can get any questions.
We had anticipated having the parent app rolled out during October. We've come up against some delays related to paperwork, legal agreements. We do have those agreements in place, so now it's a matter of sharing data with our bus company and then rolling it out to parents. So I believe the rollout date is slated for mid-November.
And the legal requirements are when we share data, we have to make sure that we're following all the letters of the law and privacy protections. So this is about doing what we always do with all data to make sure that we can move forward in a good manner.
Meg, yes?
Yeah, I had a question that came up about early bus dropped off. Whether buses needed to be dropped off early because of breakfast.
I know Jordan Mine, who oversees food service, who now also oversees transportation, is aware of the schools and the times that we do serve breakfast. So we have tried to set up drop-off times that are workable with the schools where they do offer breakfast, yet we need to make sure there's supervision on site. So some drop-offs may be earlier at some schools because of a breakfast program.
Okay.
And I'm not aware of any areas where we're having issues with that. So if you are, I'm happy to take your
So I
knowledge.
think the question was, how is that being communicated with the schools?
The bus drop-off times?
Right, because if not everybody is taking advantage of breakfast.
The principals have drop-off times for each of their buses, and if we have a bus coming late or coming too early, they do email myself and the transportation department. So we're on top of areas where a bus, if it's either coming unusually early or late. And I'm not aware of any ongoing problems with pickup or
So the
drop-off.
question, or at least so kids were being dropped off so that they could arrive for breakfast, right? And that the drop-offs were being arranged so that they could get there for breakfast, but not everybody was going to breakfast, which means that there were a large number of students who weren't needing breakfast. And then, right, what were they doing?
So it sounds like, I mean, is that, if it's a
So I think
specific
that was
school
the
issue,
que-
it should be talked
Okay.
through with the principal in terms of, the
So
drop-offs.
then the question, is that how bus routes were being created? So that students were being able to get breakfast?
I would have to check with Jordan on if they've altered drop-off times for schools that do serve breakfast. I know she's changed the method in which breakfast is served, so it's like a grab-and-go type of thing. I don't know, I'm not aware of kids arriving unusually early, but I will speak with her about it and see if she can communicate with the principals and see if we may be having concerns somewhere. We can certainly tweak drop-off times, but we do, if we're offering breakfast, we want children to be able to take advantage of it.
Absolutely. Very important.
So we can get back to you specifically on this, Meg, and then circle back.
That'd be great.
Any other questions around the transportation report?
The only other
update.
piece of information is that there's been a drop in late routes from September to October, from 53 to 21. So that's a signal of improvement, and we'll watch that carefully.
And I think we also, talked last month about the improved reporting, which is not only enables us to manage better, but it also is enabling us to capture more penalty fees, which, are small, but every dollar counts, and important that we capture penalty fees when there is because that is our mechanism, currently to deal with quality issues. So the improved reporting not only enables us hopefully to track over time, but capture the highest amount of penalty fees so that we can then have more leverage with our provider, so.
Candace, can I ask one question?
Yes.
On the update side, and maybe this is something to include for like a request for a future transportation update. Back in August, Jordan let us know that the number of routes were based on an estimate. So there was the parent survey that went out over the summer to say that, yes, I want a spot on the bus, but then because she was not sure whether it was the full number. So I'm curious if we could get an update on what what estimate that was used to create the routes and the actuals now are.
I can tell you, we're actually in process of gathering information from school principals about how many kids are riding on the buses. And we're starting with schools where we're anticipating possibly recommending some changes for next year. And we will be following up with the other schools as well. Yeah.
So because we are, I believe it's on the docket for December is that correct, to present those possible recommendations?
That's what it says in the
Yes.
So in conjunction with that, having a summary of the utilization information that you've gotten would be helpful, I think, also to show alongside the recommendations for changes.
Thank you.
And we're still pursuing the idea that at some point we want to make the transition from people affirmatively requesting bus service as opposed to we're just going to provide it for everybody, and if people don't show up, well, that's our loss.
Yes, I believe
Yeah.
we're clear about being more firm about
Yeah.
the decisions going forward, but also giving families plenty of time, ample time to prepare for that, should there be changes this year, for next year. Is that summary? Is that reflective?
Good.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you, Mary. So our last discussion item is the budget planning update, and I think it's in a couple of pieces in terms of sections. So why don't you all just drive it the way you think it most fit, and we can take breaks for questions by section or however you think.
So let me start, and then I'll pass it over to Maria, and Kathy will help out as well as we go forward. As we just talked about the taxation, the levy, a lot of the work that we're doing on budget and budget planning is really driven by the strategic plan and around the commitment to transparency and to helping to make the information more understandable and usable in the community. And as I just said, we have new budget documents, including documentation by budget category, by program areas that one can look at and see pie charts on our expenditures. The budget at a glance documentation is also part of this effort to increase transparency. In the ongoing conversation about where we're at and where we're going on budget and finance, we've also introduced, and it's not new news, but we've introduced around this table and at the board table the concerns we have about all of the budget uncertainty that we're facing, and that whether that's at the state level, where we believe there may be a shift of pension expenditures to the local education agency to us. We believe there may be at some point a new funding formula that will have an impact on us. We believe there may be a property tax freeze at some point that may have an impact on us. And so these issues, as well as any other set of unknowns that may come towards us as Springfield continues to struggle, legislative leadership and the leadership in the governor's office continues to struggle on, or not struggle, on solving the budget issues in the state of Illinois, leaves us in a certain amount of uncertainty. So as we're framing issues, as we're trying to move forward on budget planning for not only the next year, but the next several years, we're in a situation where there's a significant amount of uncertainty that we have to cope with. We've done several conversations before this group and before the board as a whole, when we're meeting as a board of a whole, again, on budget uncertainty. we had a conversation around this table around the structural deficits, where we really were looking at the rate of spend, how much our spending is increasing, given the limits from the CPI, given the limits that we have, the limitations we have. And in that conversation, which highlighted our structural deficits, we really concluded that, excuse me, that reductions or cuts alone aren't going to solve our deficits. We're going to have to look much more closely internally at our expenditures. Today, we want to have a conversation about the level of spend and do that in a comparable way. And so what we've done is we've worked to gauge our level of spend and to see how we compare with our peers. Once we present that today, we'll be able to continue the conversation that we've had over time that is about uncertainties, is about the structural deficit, and is around what we're calling benchmarking data today. A couple key takeaways before we even jump in. One, our spending, as we look at the benchmarks that Maria is about to present, our spending is mostly on par with our peers. And in some cases, it's slightly lower than our peers. Two, our spending really reflects the priorities that we have as a system, which is to focus on and invest in instruction, to focus on and invest in special needs, and to focus and invest in student services. And less so in administration, less so in transportation, and less so in facilities. And we'll come back to that conversation. And really, that overall analysis, as you'll see in a minute, or if you've seen as you've reviewed the packet, reflects our philosophy of doing everything we can to keep any reductions and future reductions as far away from the classroom as possible. Again, with our overall analysis of showing where we really have focused on instruction, special needs, and student services. So with that, we're going to jump into the data that we've collected for this stage of the conversation. I'm going to turn to Maria Allison for that part of the presentation.
Okay, great. So I'm actually going to tag team with Kathy a little bit on this. What I'll do is give an overview of how the data is packaged and what you're looking at. Hopefully a condensed version of the how to read this document that was 2 pages long, because there's a lot. This is an attempt to take a broad look at the data available on our peer districts and try to line it up where it can be compared as apples to apples as possible. All this information is technically publicly available, but if you've dug through ISB budget data and individual district data, it's not all readily, cleanly available necessarily. So our first step to pull it all together was to identify a set of districts to compare ourselves to. So that's figure 1, which is the list of districts we looked at. We're at the top. District 202 we included, just given that they're our neighbor and high school counterpart. The 5 districts below were selected out of a larger list that we started with based on many of the districts in the Achievement and Accountability Report. We tried to look at overall budget, demographics, location, district size, and come up with a number of districts that we could look at that was representative and manageable, since, like I mentioned, a lot of the data we pulled involved going to individual district budget documents or filing FOIA requests to get some of the data points. Doing this across 20 districts would have been not really feasible. So figure 1 is the list of districts we started with. The next step was to try to compare our spending across the areas that were comparable. So to summarize all that data in one place, we have this color coding system that you'll see on the next 2 figures that basically uses the median of our peer district spending and categorized us as higher or lower or roughly the same, using a plus or minus 5% around the median threshold. So based on that, the color key that you see has the darkest blue saying that we're over 5% above that median of our peers. The middle color blue is within 5% of the peer median, and the lightest blue is over 5% below the peer median. There's also a font size distinguisher in here in the high neutral low column of figure 3 that basically just used a larger size font to represent things that are bigger pieces of our budget. since sometimes we're talking about budget lines that represent, less than 1% of our budget, and sometimes it's something that represents upwards of 20% of the budget. So trying to have a way to show both those dimensions in one spot. And I appreciate, Omar, that it is both kind of clean and still a lot of information to get onto one page. So what we looked at, each major budget function, which Kathy's going to walk through and explain what the definitions of these are, is broken out. Then we have programs or categories where things are indented a line. That is usually illustrative, not exhaustive of what falls under the level above it. Because
You're on figure 3?
I'm sorry, I'm on figure 3, yes. And so usually the things that were pulled out there are the things that are the biggest. And what will total up if you were trying to get out your calculator and add things up to 100 is the function level stuff. So the instruction bucket at 49%, special services at 18, administration, site improvement, facilities, debt services, and community services, and other. So again, Kathy's going to give you a walkthrough of definitions, but I just wanted you to know where those all came from. For each line, we show the percent of the budget, the actual dollar amount, the cost per student, that comparison I just referenced, higher, neutral, lower, to our peers, the peer district median cost per student, and then we have a separate column for District 202. So they were not factored into the peer median because their numbers, as you can see, are much different, and they would have really skewed that. So we just put them as their own column because often people ask, if this is our data, what does it look like down the street at ETHS? So they're listed there separately. We also broke out special education separately. That's at the bottom. And that's because special ed is not a function or a program. It's actually embedded in all the other categories. But this was a sort of double click on special education expenses separated so that you can see that. And Joyce isn't here tonight to speak to it, but she went through all this data with us really carefully. And if there are other questions on the special ed part in particular, we'll answer to the extent we can and flag questions for Joyce and get back to people. So with that overview on what you're looking at and how it was compiled, I guess I'll pass it, Kathy, if you want to give the category definitions.
So I would like to go back to the pie charts and kind of explain what's behind slices of the pie, where the expenses are coming from, and just give a little bit more detail, because some of the names may not trigger a place in the budget where the information is coming from. So let me start with figure 2, budget by function. And by the way, these pie charts represent overall district's budget. This is not just operating budget that we typically present. These are all expenditures. And Maria, do you want me to highlight while I'm going, just say which one's neutral, which one's high, and okay. And I'll try to do it briefly. So starting with the biggest one, instruction. These represent all instruction-related expenditures throughout various programs: bilingual, regular, special education, pre-K, expenditures for teachers, teacher assistants, supplies such as block grants. 49% of the budget, that's what we presented in our budget documents. So this is in line with what was presented. Community services, 3.5%, 3.15%. It's highlighted as high. However, these expenditures, which relate to Family Center, childcare, and Head Start program, are a wash. I mean, they are paid for. They're coming from local fees, they're coming from state and federal grants. The next one is other expenditures, which include payments for special education tuition. It's actually catch-it-all, a group. Certain benefits, ERO, termination benefits, and various benefits paid to our employees, life insurance, disability, and certain TRS benefits. Debt services, also high, because, again, we do a lot of projects, not because I'm sorry, I lost my thought. It's 4.8%, and they include payments for interest and principal in our budget. And in comparison to our peer school districts, they are in the high category. Site improvement, 7.1%. These are expenditures from Fund 64. They include capital expenditures, not what we spend for maintenance of our buildings, but additions and improvements. Facilities, neutral, 6.4% of our budget. This is basically the operations and maintenance fund budget. So salaries for our custodians, maintenance, supplies, utilities, and capital improvement. Administration, 8.4% approximately, neutral category. This is both site administration, so principals, assistant principals, also school secretaries, and general administration, so this building.
Isn't that lower?
Those last two are both low.
Lower?
They are low.
Than our peers?
Well, they both neutral, right?
No,
They're
lower.
lower. Oh, I'm sorry, they are lower. So they are both lower. Going to the chart below, this is a breakdown of our instructional expenditures. And you can see that with an instruction that is neutral, there are some areas that are higher and some that are lower. So regular programs, which account for 35% of the instructional expenditures, are higher. Bilingual program are lower, and they only account for 1.5% of the budget. Remedial and supplemental program, which stands for Title I expenditures, and again, these are funded with federal grants. They are, I think they are higher.
Looks like
Maria, right? They are
Although in the detail,
neutral.
In the detail, it looks like higher, actually.
It's hard to
It's
see.
a little,
figure 3 is the detail.
I think that's lower.
That's lower. Yes, it's lower.
It's lower.
So Kathy, could I ask a quick question on that? So it says remedial and supplemental programs, but it's only a subsection, you're saying, it's really only Title I.
It's just Title I. Yes, we
They
take,
do other, I think RTI, for example, is maybe intervention-type programming, but that's not captured here,
right, because
correct?
we doing, this exercise is done by function. And it's every year when we submit our budget, we present our functions in accordance to the state code. And certain functions may be coded with the remedial supplemental program function, and some may not be. So only what is caught with that function in our budget will be presented in that piece of the pie.
I understand. My question is it truly limited to Title I funding?
In this
That type of
exercise,
programming that is being funded by Title I, or is it supposed to represent that programming?
right here, it's only Title I.
Okay.
So where do you find the other sources of funding for that? Are there other?
Yes, we have poverty grant, we have other grants, and again, the funds are spent in accordance to that grant. Whatever the functions the state or the grantee dictates us to code our expenditures, that's how we spend them. I mean, we would need to go back and look into individual programs to determine, how the expenditures are coded. But I believe when the money, when we look at that budget, it was at that function, it was only Title I.
Can I ask one more follow-up on the same concept? Is it same true for bilingual? Because that surprised me that it would be lower given TWE. Are we accounting for TWE in a different way?
TWE is not, TWE, and we had this discussion from many years, but TWE is actually considered part of general education, and it's coded with a regular instruction function, not a bilingual function. So going back to bilingual, the only thing that the only expenditures that are coded with bilingual functions are supplemental, expenditures, TPE, TBI programs, and again, these are funded with state and federal
Do we get some funding from
Yes.
Tweethos?
We do not get any more funding. I believe it ended 2005 or 2004, but originally, yes, we did. That was a federal program.
So if you have pure ESL classes, those would be in those would be in this bilingual programs? Or what's represented in there?
Well, 3 classes are not represented, no.
So what is represented?
Well, these are the pull-out services. TWE aids are actually coded here, but not the teachers. Teachers are included with general instructional.
So actually, to
function.
understand what, say, TWE was costing us, or all our bilingual efforts were costing us, we'd have to cut some out of regular programming, put that together with what we got for
Correct.
bilingual, and then we'd have an accurate feel for that.
And the reason why the TWE aids are included here is because they are written into bilingual grant.
But if you have, so I'm just trying to think that like an ESL class, is that included here or is that in general regular programs? Any kind of other than TWE format designed within the district, where would that be captured?
Well, if bilingual teachers will be here, but not TWE teachers. So they will be included in bilingual function,
Okay.
but not,
So for ESL,
ESL
you're
teachers
saying-
would be in the bilingual program. So in some respects, it's, looking at the comparables as a comparison of the design of execution on bilingual programming potentially, right? It looks like then other schools, other districts would be pursuing ESL from this more than they would a TWE if they aren't, if they're tracking it the same way, I guess.
I think you said
You
it.
have to take your public comment. Do you want to relate to this?
Yeah, I think you have to look at the demographics of the districts. Most of those districts have 3 times as many ESL kids as us.
Right, but this is but the actual breakdowns are on a per student basis, so this is not, but on the figure 3, it's per student, so it is based on, it's across them, it's based on per student, so we look much lower on a per student basis, not just on an aggregate. I know that on an aggregate basis, we would be much lower.
I guess we
but
can
you-
take it offline. I don't agree that that's the way to look at it.
Well, I'm just telling you that's the way it is being looked at here.
Right,
We
which
can
I-
argue a different thing, but that's.
Yeah, I just think this isn't, I think this is misleading. So I'm just trying to make that point.
Well, if you are spending less per student than another district per student does, then that is looking at apples to apples. What's misleading about it is it doesn't accumulate the types of programming we have because we have a considerable TWE
But
population.
are we the only district that's doing?
We are not, but we don't know what
program?
these other districts are doing.
Can I ask a question? When we're looking at ESL, are we looking at dollars per ESL student? Or, okay, so you're just breaking out the ESL students?
Correct, so it's
It's not per student.
This is per student or per ESL student?
per ESL student is what the
I don't
note says.
think it is. That's the problem.
I'm not sure that
It says,
accurate.
I believe the note on
Bilingual,
percent of ELL students.
based on
note
ELL
number
student
3.
percent. Yeah.
Note number 3 on whatever the last page is. Bilingual per student costs were estimated using fall enrollment and the percent of ELL students in the district.
So unless otherwise noted, the per student costs were divided by overall district enrollment, but
In that
for
case.
instances like bilingual programs or some of our like speech down in the special ed section, if we note that it was divided by particular student served because we were able to actually do that, it would be noted in this document. So part of the, just a sort of overall statement on this is part of the challenge is if we were to conceptually take a bucket of services that we do and roll up our budget lines in a way that we feel represents it, we might be re-aggregating things in a different way than it's reported out to the state, but then we wouldn't be able to do the peer comparisons because we wouldn't be able to go blow their districts or their budgets apart and re-aggregate them in the way that matches the way we would re-aggregate our own. So the challenge is we could do a deep dive on any individual area of our own spending and take our individual budget lines and pull them together in a way that really represents that body of work. But in doing that, we would lose the ability to compare it to our peers because we couldn't do the same for all of their budgets. So comparing sort of state level reporting budget lines to state level reporting budget lines was the goal for this, but it does make it more difficult to do some of what you guys are just talking about.
Yeah, Jennifer, is it on this? And then,
Yep, so two questions. When you were thinking about peer comparisons, did you think about using any of the districts from the Minority Student Achievement Network? So which would possibly be, they're not geographic peers, but they might look more like our district in terms of the type of students. And then two, just for the viewing audience and maybe for all of us, I understand what you did for the analysis, but can you tell us a little bit more about why you did it and how it's going to be used going forward?
So on the first question, I have to go back and look at some of the districts in the Minority Student Achievement Network. Oak Park is in there, so that's one. Many of the districts are outside of the state, so we would have to actually go beyond the call to try to figure out how to do apples and apples. And I'd have to look and see on the other ones that might be in Illinois, so I can get back to you on that.
Could we hold the question? I think the point of the question around how are we using this is really valid. I was trying to get through the information first so that we could then be able to ask and talk about
We're
that.
done with that part, that's all right.
I'm not sure that we are.
Can I ask a question just about, so we're comparing districts that have similar demographics to ours, but when we look at things like our instructional programs and we break out teachers and specialists, and we're talking about how much we're spending per student in our overall how much we spend, but it seems to me since the cost of living is so much higher in Evanston, I'd imagine our salaries are higher than some of these comparable districts. Is that true or not? It's not how much are we getting more? Are we getting the same amount for our money, or are we in fact paying more? If we're paying more for instruction, are we paying more for the same services, or are we actually getting more?
I think that's exactly the next level of question that this kind of document was meant to start the conversation around. So starting the look of how does our spending compare to people just directionally, more or less, and then trying to understand the factors if there are places we want to sort of double click or dig in on. This would point us in the direction to ask those exact type of questions. So I don't have an answer for it, but I think that's where this would go.
Great.
So if there aren't any other just questions around the actual factual data or meanings, let's clear that out first. If you have meaning questions, and then let's move into some more insights.
I'm a little confused about the instruction and then the support, and then the special ed was broken out, but then it looks like it was broken out. Can you help me to understand that?
Pie chart?
I think I'm on figure 2, but then there's 2 figures. There's 2 pie charts.
You're in the pie charts? Is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's special services, is that what you're asking?
Yeah, so it looks like, I think I'm on figure 2, instruction and support services.
Are you on budget details, special services? The one-
That one also.
Budget by function is what you're
Meg, I'm sorry, what is the question? What's in it?
Okay, I think
So I think I'm on page 154
Right.
and 155. And
Support services only.
I'm trying to understand about the special ed not separated. And then it looks like instruction and special ed instruction, so help me to understand, I'm a little confused.
So special ed is not a function, it's just a program in the budget. And so the pie figure 2 has these various services or expenditures. Special education expenditures are in all of these little wedges, basically. So you're going to have special education instruction in instruction, support services, things like speech, OT, included in support services, administration of special services, include administration, and so on. So it's not a separate a wedge of the pie. We do have analysis. I understand we don't have all the peer district comparison yet in the table, but we don't have a pie chart specifically on special education.
So I think one of the issues is that on figure 2, Meg, that you're looking at there, the 18% of support services is not special ed. However, when you look at figure 3, it correlates to an item called special services, so that's a bit confusing.
Yeah.
So,
But what's the difference between special services and support services?
And I think I'm looking
they
at.
represent the same thing,
Right.
they're called two different things, which they should not be, so.
Okay.
Okay?
They should all be called support services, or they should all be called special
Yeah,
services.
let's just say they're special services, because on figure 3, you have the detail then of what's included in there.
In there, yeah.
And that represents
Okay.
18% of the budget, which is also footing with what's called support services. So I think that, just the nomenclature is confusing.
Yep. Called it the different thing in 2.
And then, beyond that, in terms of breaking out special education, it is broken out for us
And I do see that.
separately.
Yes.
On figure 3. But for the purposes of figure 2, it's embedded into
Yes.
each of those areas.
And it's just the little notes, number 1 and 2 kind of contradict each other. Regular programs are instructional activities designed for students who do not require special programs. And then instruction other.
Instruction other actually includes instructional expenditures for special education and regular pre-K programs. So that's where these numbers are. But again, only teachers and teacher assistants, not support services. They're going to be on the next pie charts when we break that 18% into other student and staff services. Okay.
Crystal?
Not at all.
Should I explain what's included in the pie chart on the next page? Because,
Yes?
okay.
The next page being what?
Being what? Not a figure. It's
Okay.
just-
So we on the next page,
services.
top pie chart, and under staff, it says special services, but it's really staff's services. We have improvement of instruction type of expenditures. That's where the coaches, expenditures for the coaches, substitutes for professional development, and also expenditures for professional development are included, as well as assessment and testing type of expenditures.
Where are
On
you?
155?
155 on the top pie chart.
You're supposed to say
It says
what?
special services.
Special services other?
No, the
Just
title.
Special, staff special service. I think what's confusing about this pie chart is the special, word special. It's just services.
Let
Student
me
services.
suggest that you look on page 156 for a moment, and at the longer chart. And you'll see in the second, Meg, do you have, there it is. In the second bucket, you have special services. And special services, which, if you just go across my line for a second.
Support services.
But let me keep going for a second. Special services, which is 18% of the budget. And then that's broken down into student services and staff services. The student services are then broken down into what you can see as the white bullets below. And the staff services are what are broken down into improvement of instruction, media services, and assessment testing. So that's a little bit clearer than, and we'll take it upon advisement on these pie charts on how to be clear.
Apologies for the labeling inconsistency on that.
But this pie chart that she was referring to that says special services, it's trying to depict the full 18%?
Yes.
Correct.
And breaking it out into staff, special services, student special services.
Correct.
Right, and that
And
staff
then-
services at the 3.69 corresponds to the staff services 3.69 on the figure 3 table. So that's what that wedge.
So the staff special services is lower and the student special services is neutral there. Correct. Okay.
Right, and student services includes things like transportation food service, speech, psychology, and also data processing. And that's probably one of the components that's making this wedge wider, because data processing expenditures come from Fund 65. These are technology, bond, capital funded expenditures. And again, these pie charts not only include operating expenditures, but also capital.
So, now that we have somewhat digested the data, let's talk about what this tells us and what it might point to going forward to inform our processes. And I think, Jennifer, to your question, we can talk about how we believe it should and can be used. I think the intent and the way it was discussed in the memo is this is another input to what will be our budget discussions, so that you could say, let's just say you're entertaining options about reduction areas. This is a point of reference, among other things, that let's look at how we compare to our peer districts if we're making certain types of considerations. It doesn't mean we would start with this as the driver to identifying areas, I don't think, but it would be yet another piece of reference for that. I'm interested to hear, though, from folks, that have sat with this, if there are particular things that jump out at them, or areas that we may need to point a red flag that you would want more analysis, or we could entertain that as we go forward. I think we wanted to lay it out today. I want to thank the team for the work that's been done. I think it is helpful to see at a high level and at a moderate level, these points of comparison, understanding that it's never going to be totally perfect because we're dealing with other people's data and it's hard enough to get understanding of your own data. So trying to create some comparisons that can be useful. I have some thoughts on what I think, what I would take as takeaways, but I don't want to go first. So other people have any thoughts on how they think this could be used, or insights other things that jump out at you?
I guess I have some, I think it provides some useful information, but I do also have concerns, because I feel like, just based on even our questions here, that it doesn't necessarily give us accurate information for what, so for example, the bilingual services doesn't include TWE costs. That to me is a significant flaw for us moving forward in how we're going to use this. I don't know how we resolve that. I appreciate the point that we can't do that because of the way it's reported to the state. But to me, that in some way limits, it's useful. I don't know how we resolve the fact that this reports it in one way because it's reported to the state, but maybe in terms of what actually our spend is on things might not be reflected here. So I don't know how we resolve that.
And I think there are places that will be more prominent and more of an issue than in other places, and that's why we'll have to probably weigh, because that, in most cases, and it probably is true, would be a true statement, if the differences are hugely stark, like in bilingual, there might be something else going on. So in some respects, it's the outliers that we would need to kind of put aside and say and understand why are they outliers, and what I would think. But if we believe separate from this, so this is a benchmarking exercise, is if we believe separate from this that we want to understand how our bilingual programming costs are relative, if that's really important, then that requires primary data collection, basically. That requires picking a set of school districts that you actually go in and you find out how are they categorizing their cost versus us. So I think it's a different piece of work, right? To be useful for that, if that's something.
Well, right, yeah, and it would have to have comparable it would have to have a TWE program or something comparable to what we
I think there's two questions here. One is looking at how you deal with bilingual programming overall, and what is the total cost of that, whether it's our strategy by being primarily TWE and someone else is different. And then you could break it down beyond that. So point taken, I think it's, Omar? What do you think?
So I think I like the document. I feel like the board asks all the time, what's the comparison? So that answers the comparison. I want to know what surprised you about, like, when you looked at the data, what did you see that, what's your question? What surprised you? What's your thoughts? And I don't know which one of you want to answer, but.
I can answer some of this. In comparison, but I wasn't sure, based on, if you follow our methodology and if you look at this chart on page 156, I wasn't sure how our cost per student spend compared at the macro level. At the micro level, we've got to actually figure out how to dig deep, whether it's on bilingual or on TWE or on other things. But I was surprised, I guess, at the level of when we do the analysis where we're neutral, where we're very close or lower than the median cost. I think that was a surprise to me. I don't know if I was wondering whether or not we were so far exceeding, but it's actually rather close. So I think that was a piece as well. I don't know what else I guess on the administrative costs were, at or below what our comparable districts are doing, and at or below what, if we can compare with the ETHS, I think there's lower costs than the comparable districts. I think if you draw some comparisons between how we spend and how our colleagues at 202 spend, we tend to spend lower as well there. So, so that's a piece of the puzzle that is not really of surprise, but of interest to me. So I looked at this as a good descriptor of where we sit, given the way we built the methodology with some comparable districts, and it gives us at least some rough roadmap of being able to conclude what I started with, that we've actually invested more in instruction and special services and less in administration and facilities and transportation.
May I add a thought? For me, it was more affirmation of what we've been saying to the board for probably the last 3 or 4 years. I know we've been reducing in facilities, but I was actually surprised to see that our cost for facility maintenance is on the low side. I thought we would be in the neutral column, but I guess with all the reductions that took place over the years, we are really on the low end, because as you all know, we added square footage, but we reduced positions. With community services, for example, I knew that it's going to be high, and I believe that was reported during the budget presentation, that the state average was 1% average spend. We were at 3%, and now with the Head Start program, we're probably going to be approaching 4%, but it's all paid for. And we really don't subsidize these programs. So I think because some programs are high spend, it doesn't mean that it's costing us more. So that was an affirmation for me of I guess, data that I've been collecting for the budget building process. And actually transportation services, I was very surprised that food service and transportation services were low. I thought that we would be on a high or medium range, but we're not spending that much in comparison to our peer districts.
Please.
I would think from any of these categories, you could go deeper and figure out what the actual comparisons, we aggregate some of the sources of funding for bilingual. But what I would think what you'd want to do is look at those. For instance, what jumps out at me, first the bilingual did, but then, for instance, summer school programs. So we're high on summer school programs at $577,000, where we come down $300,000 in the last 3 years. If we are in fact high, we should evaluate, I mean, it's helpful for the board to know, because we're always worried that we're shrinking that program, which we have been doing, but are we being effective in that? And that's just one more, I mean, if we are not doing well and we're spending way above other districts, then that's even greater cause for doubling down on our efforts or cutting back on our costs or whatever it is, but it's just another piece of the equation, which is helpful for me to know, because I've always wondered. So some of these things that break out either high or low, make me think we need to go deeper on these particular categories. And instruction, I really think if we're going to make the claim we are spending higher, then we really need to look at how salaries factor into that and what that really means. Because that would be good to know that we truly are spending more on instruction.
It's an interesting point, just going back to summer school, that if we look at summer school as a commitment to help kids who have great needs, then on one side you can say, oh, well, the spend shows that we have that commitment. The secondary question is, to what effect and to what impact, and how do we come back on that?
If I can build off of Tracy's comment, two things. First, you were giving a specific example of something I was thinking about, and that is what are our goals in looking at this? And one of them, I think, is for us as a board and administration input and teachers and community to say, excuse me, are we making the right levels of investment? What sort of outcomes are we getting relative to those investments? And where are there opportunities to either decrease or where we need to increase? And your example, I think, was getting to that specifically. Something separately that struck me as I was looking at this, and I don't know that we can truly account for it at this level, but I wonder as we start to go into a deeper analysis, I like your reference to a double click. There are a lot of funds that come in that support line items here that would contribute to an impact in areas. I'm thinking like summer school. Well, we've reduced what we're spending, but we're seeing increases from the Y and from Foundation 65 and YOU. And we know from what their data tells us that it's having a positive impact. And so I just wonder how we account for that. Or I think about the PTAs and what they do to invest in some instructional types of programs. I don't know if that's a big enough dollar amount or big enough impact, but I feel like somehow we might need to identify dollars that lie outside of our budget that are significant enough dollar-wise that we might want to weigh in how they're contributing to the impact.
Well,
and I know that's not an easy thing to do.
Right.
So.
Well, just to add on to that, what might be useful to know is which of these programs, like you said, some things are paid for. They're in our budget, but we get the money from another source, or some are supplemented, as you said, by the Y or whatever. And it might be nice to know which of those programs are such. Like summer school, if all that other funding went away, and we were just left with what we have, what would we be able to do?
And to me, it's not important to include that those additional funds for benchmarking purposes,
right?
But more for our own program analysis.
And I think along those lines too is like how much of it is because we spend this amount, we're getting this from a community partner. So if we cut that amount, we're also would be cutting, an additional, services that we're getting.
Right.
So then would it be just so easy to say, we can cut that?
But again, if we just use summer school as the example, it's 0.48% of the overall budget. So that's another, maybe, Omar, that's another surprise is as we break down break down these categories. Some of the things that we value very much are things that are really quite a small portion of the overall macro budget.
And that's a really great example because I suspect most of the board would say that they think that's a really good 0.5% of our budget to spend. I mean, I think we've looked more at that, not that there's not room to improve still, but
Right.
that we're trying to use that money more wisely than we have in the past. And I think we've improved on that along with the help of our community partners.
I think one similar to that, and I mean, my eyes gravitate towards the highs and the lows, just to, as most humans would. When we look at, I was surprised, and quite frankly, in staff services, just that, that relatively speaking, we have a higher on average cost. I think that my assumption was that it would be on par, but not that it would necessarily be higher.
On staff services?
Yeah, on staff services. So the improvement of instruction specifically, sorry, I'm not under staff. I'm sorry,
special
you're right.
services?
You're going to go there again? Under special services, under staff services, I actually meant improvement of instruction. I said staff
Right.
services, sorry, because my eyes are going. So, which I know has more than coaches, professional development, and subs, but those are the big quantities. I think that's an area too where it's really getting at more information is really a design question. It's not necessarily, the benchmarking can point this out, but thinking about, what is our instructional design and what is the effectiveness of that in terms of how are we deploying the resources and how does that compare to other places. It's not a continue-on benchmarking effort, but it is something that would be more of a design as we look at how we're organized for success. And it's also, it's indicative, certainly, the regular program instruction and the improvement of instruction categories, in many ways, I'm glad we're spending more, right? I mean, that does reflect our values, that those are very important things.
I am curious about that, though, because that's all lumped under special services, and we do have coaches, and we do have professional development, and we do have subs in regular instruction, so.
Again, this is not, special services does not mean special ed.
Correct.
That's why originally it was called support services. So it'd be all,
And
all those
it's
supports.
actually interesting enough, this is the wording from the state document budgets.
Yeah.
and
Well, that does not mean that we should
But-
necessarily
yes,
use it.
Absolutely.
So that was one takeaway I had. I think if you look at, and this is a bit of a jump, but if you go back to and look at the criteria, this page that had criteria for selection of these other schools, there's some interesting data there too, which is the number of schools and the enrollment. And the areas which we have higher spending actually, to me, is more correlated with the number of sites we maintain than it is, quite frankly, anything else. There are other pieces, but site improvement costs, obviously, that's going to be driven by the number of sites you have. Our debt services, because most of that money is spent on capital, which is to maintain mostly our capital and technology, is driven by the number of sites we have. I was surprised that, when you look at building administration, so building administration in and of itself does look higher than the comparison group. But when you actually look at it on a per building cost level, it's lower. So comparing 354,000 to 375,000. So again, that says to me that the building administration costs are driven by the number of sites, not necessarily that we have more building administration in any given site. And I only say that because I think, this is again a value that we have in maintaining and supporting neighborhood schools and magnet programs.
Yep.
It's not necessarily a low-cost endeavor. So that is something that I would not have thought of before I had seen this data. And I think it's interesting. When you look at those like-sized districts that we're comparing ourselves to, just the like-size ones, I took out 68 because they are much smaller. But in like-sized districts, the average number of students per site is 584 versus our 479. So on average, it's about 100 students more. That probably varies depending on whether it's an elementary school or a middle school. So I think that the class sizes are comparable for the most part. They're a little different at the middle school level.
Yeah, I
Ours are a
wonder,
little lower at the middle school level. That's also included in that chart.
how
See that?
did you get average class size for middle school?
Maria, how did Becca calculate that?
She called the districts.
But what's the basis? What's the formula?
So I
Number of
think-
middle school students divided by number of teachers in a building, or what is it?
I think it's the way ISB calculates it, which is enrollment divided by certified staff. I think, is it certified staff in the building?
Divided by staff?
Or teaching positions. I can verify that for you, but it's however ISB did it so that it would be consistent across everyone, but there is some concern that that's not the most accurate, but I think the best we can say is that it's whatever error factors in there is equal to everyone.
I understand the necessity to have a similar formula and an easily obtainable one for all the comparisons, but probably in terms of, for us, just looking at ourselves, that I don't feel like that's very accurate. I mean, it was very rare. That's a very small number for the actual,
Our average.
Our average? I think so. I think it's I think
Well, I mean-
19 is really low for a middle school class.
So, well, it's 20, but.
Oh, wow. Okay, that's really low for a middle school class.
It's an average. So, and that is what's reported on ISB. If you look at our middle schools,
Yeah,
each one,
and
you
for
can look
ISB
at
that
each
might
middle
be.
school and it's different. So that's an average across all. But it's just comparing apples to, but my point was that there aren't really huge differences in the class sizes, right? The differences, there's variance certainly, but on average, the average sizes compared to ours, except for the middle school level.
Can I just mention one other thing I meant to earlier when I was talking about the outcomes? And I thought as we double click and we start looking more specifically at opportunities within some of these line items, it would be interesting to map some of those areas to our scorecard. And just thinking about, when I talked about outcomes and measures, right, like that could be a specific way that we're looking at line items, right? So if we're investing in certain areas, where might we expect to drive change with the measures that we've already identified? And so it's not that you have to go through an exercise to do that, but just as you're all doing your work and thinking about that, I would imagine you'll get to a point where you'll want to make those connections to outcomes, and that seems like a good place to do it.
Are there other thoughts?
One last question, and I think you already mentioned this, but I apologize that I've already forgotten the answer. Where is technology in all of this, and are we going to have a comparison of technology spending?
Technology, well, it's actually broken into two places. There is some included in general administration, but the majority is sitting in services under student services. That's where the data processing is. Because we have two, it's not just one function, it's a couple functions, and the state puts them in two different. So the fix and break type of things will be under building administration, and then things like leases, buying new instructional technology included in student services.
What about instructional media? Is that another-
Instructional media is in educational media. That was.
Wasn't that the libraries?
That's in support.
That's the library side.
I thought that was libraries.
I think it's going to be in student services. No, I'm sorry, it's under staff, educational media services, the 1.3 million.
It's for staff for libraries.
Yes,
Yeah.
So,
which actually, to me, doesn't make sense because they do support students, but But that's how the state groups them.
Again, one of the things we're highlighting is that there are several, as I listen, there are several things of interest to the board. One is technology, two is bilingual services. It's hard to find them in the categories by which we're constrained, and so we have to think about how we can, at least at the home office, figure out how we can document some of that for a continued conversation, not only around this table, but with our colleagues who are staff in the system and our colleagues who are community members in the area. So I walk away with some good input on and questions around bilingual education or bilingual programs, around technology. There's some conversation that we just had about summer school, and then tying a lot of these ideas to outcomes and what we can at least tie the investments to the outcomes. If we can actually make that argument, that would be helpful in moving the process forward. And then, indeed, it's hard, but that shouldn't stop us from at least trying a little bit, and then coming back and saying we can only go so far with our analysis.
And not to make it be more work, but something you could consider for the benchmarking purposes. I feel like sticking to the categories and classifications that you knew would produce the most accurate benchmarks possible made sense. But now maybe you toss those out and the next analysis is just by the categories that would make sense for our own decision making. And you probably were already thinking that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, but that's a good point. And to Jennifer's question earlier too, like this, what is the reason to do this? This document was never supposed to be an end point. It's a starting point, right? So it's
variable.
Exactly. It's one piece of information that's meant to guide us toward the right place to ask deeper questions, because there's an infinite number of places we could dig into budget data, and we could do that the whole time at the expense of everything else we do. But this is hopefully one way to help us understand it. It's one piece that needs context to understand it. There's really good questions about size of our district, number of buildings we have, where we've prioritized, where we've cut in the past, that all touches to all of this. And it's not a, turn to the H and, only drill down there. High doesn't necessarily mean bad, low doesn't necessarily mean good. It's just so I think the conversation that happened here tonight was really the goal of this document, was to stimulate more conversation around understanding our spending in more detail.
Thanks, Richard.
Can I just mention one more thing? I'm sorry. Just continuing to reflect on this, looking at reading and math, and looking at what we're spending per student on reading, $591, and math, $445, and just seeing, the percentage of the budgets and thinking about how the investment we're making and the outcomes that we're getting in those areas. And most notably, I'm thinking, the 5 essentials, we saw that students said that the math curriculum was very rigorous and that the language arts programming wasn't as rigorous, and yet our spending is the opposite, right? And I don't know what might be causing that.
That was middle school, yeah.
I get that.
But this is one, too, that we did not explain, but I think probably needs clarification as to what does this actually mean? Are these reading programs and math programs? Because if you look on it, its face compared to fine arts programs, I know we don't spend half as much on reading and math as we do fine arts. So it seems to me, it goes back to the discussion that we had when we looked at the budget by program. And tell me if I'm wrong, but reading programs would be targeted reading programs, not ELA teachers, not, so they're, supplemental.
Check was what was included in these lines. I would need to go back and check.
Okay, but,
I think you're right.
I mean, it wouldn't pass the smells test otherwise, really.
Yeah.
Because it must be just,
Yeah, but the middle school teachers were classified as either math or reading, but then when you're at the elementary school, we didn't decide
right.
those to either.
So if we could have just a double check
Yeah,
on
that's a
what's
really good point.
included there. But I get the intent of your point, which is interesting. I'm just not sure if these numbers are.
Support the point. Yeah.
We know we're not spending twice as much on fine arts as we are on.
Right.
We know that, for sure.
So it's because it's all the
Right.
dedicated fine arts staff versus
Exactly.
not taking a portion of.
A portion of,
a home
right.
teacher, a room teacher, so. So it goes back to the programmatic component. You know, I do think the other thing I would add to your summary, Paul, and I think it was a great one, you know, looking at our compare on the bilingual services, what more we might do there, this summer school time, some of these ideas to outcomes. I think what Tracy had said was a little bit deeper analysis of the regular program spend to understand what's driving that high. Is it salaries? Is it more teachers? Is it more other resources? For us, not in a comparable state, but just in starting to look at our own spend.
Yeah, theoretically, it'd be very interesting to say, take your typical elementary school teacher, you know, given whatever grade, and if you could see like, all right, let's take a fifth grade teacher, and in terms of time, divide up their salary that way, but then also the materials that they use in delivering each of those areas of curriculum. That could be, then we could see how much we're spending on STEM versus how much we're spending on math versus how much we're spending on reading versus how much we're spending on social studies and then specials. It would be, I think, interesting and perhaps very enlightening.
I do too. I want to.
It would be hard. I'm not saying
I want to caution
and I
us
would
that-
like it by next week.
Right. I want to, this is really engaging. It's proving very helpful for us as we go into the next stages of the conversation that we need to all have on budget and finances. And then we need to think amongst ourselves on what we can do and how we can do it in a way that's presentable and understandable. I think that's the other piece here. We've got a little bit of work to do. Meg, I want to honor your confusion that, you know, and just sort of, we need to figure out how to take the categories, articulate them in a way that's understandable so that when we actually break this out for broader public consumption beyond folks who are listening tonight or watching tonight, that we can actually be very clear on where we're at.
And could you clarify one more thing for me, maybe while you're going back to clarify? Can you clarify what the difference is between instruction, that 49%? I keep thinking that the 49%, that the regular programs, like the 35 and everything underneath that should be adding up to the 49, but it's not. So I'm looking on the
Yep.
figure 3.
Yep.
So
Because it doesn't include from the pie chart the instruction other, for example.
So I guess I was thinking that the 49%,
Should equal the
that the regular programs was a piece of the instruction.
Yes.
So
That's
the
what I
numbers
thought,
aren't
too.
adding up for me. So maybe when you clarify for the next time, could you clarify?
Sure, and I'll just point you to the first of the small pie charts. That's the breakdown of the 49% of instruction. Here's your instruction, 49%, and then this breaks out your 49 between regular programs, bilingual programs, remedial and supplemental summer school, and instruction other.
So on here,
Instruction other is not included on what you're looking at.
Right.
Right, because we didn't
So that's why it
benchmark
doesn't
the
add up on
other
that sheet
bucket.
either.
so it doesn't add up on this sheet.
Correct.
Right, because
So-
what was pulled out on this sheet were the things that were bigger or comparable. We didn't compare other across all the districts because everybody's other bucket means something different. So doing a benchmark on other didn't feel as meaningful.
So I think it was confusing the fact that it did not add up on this sheet.
Okay. So you want to,
May I give an overview of sort of where we are and where we think we're going? So first of all, thank you for feedback because this is very helpful. As I said earlier, we've started on this pathway of hoping to make our budget and finance conversations more transparent, and we've gotten very good and good critical feedback on how to even work with the information that we've presented tonight to make it much clearer. We've focused on the structural deficit and the rate of spending growth, and we've done this dive into benchmarking comparisons with a lot of feedback on how we move forward. What I want to do is continue this conversation in a couple ways. I think it's important to engage our broader community, and that's our community of colleagues within the system and our community members who live in Evanston and Skokie around some of the issues that we're highlighting here. I also think that it's still important to convene or reconvene the Budget Advisory Committee, which was, as I had suggested, which was going to be the Financial Sustainability Subcommittee of the Strategic Plan, along with a few extra members. And what I'd like to do is continue on the pathway of providing the broad range of stakeholders inside the system and who live in our cities an overview of the budget, an overview of the data that we've collected so far. We can make this presentable and understandable so that we can actually move forward on understanding in a little bit more clear ways where we're at and where we're going financially. We don't necessarily see substantial reductions of budget for next year. Where we see potential substantial reductions is in the following year, is in 17, 18. And so we have some time, I believe, unless we get a big curveball by the state, which is a big unless, but we have some time, not a lot, to be able to work on this work and to be able to present it to community members and present it to colleagues again within the system, which means holding some internal town hall meetings of some sort. So what I'm suggesting, I think we've come before this group in the past and said that we were going to go out and survey our community members. I think before we survey our community members, we should actually continue a conversation like this with a wide range of stakeholders. Get feedback, get questions, get concerns, so that then we can actually frame a future survey in a way that would be reflective of the concerns that people have, and also pay attention to what's going on in the local and state economy. So our next steps are to convene the Budget Advisory Committee to go through all the materials we have, to do one or two either community sessions and some staff sessions to be able to look at some of this information and to try to get feedback and information so that we can continue the conversation that we're having here. And as we move forward into planning for next year, but really for the following year, where at this stage the budget looks like we're going to have to make some substantial moves one way or the other. So that's that, and we've got some assignments to think about here on the range of lists, from bilingual summer school, tying to outcomes, the deeper analysis of the regular program spend. I think we're going to need to come back and say, here's what we can do, and here's what's beyond our scope, and so that we can actually keep the conversation going.
Okay. Any questions on that?
My only thought on that, and I'm glad that we're holding back on the survey portion of it, but I don't know what our timeline is in terms of like presenting this information, but I guess I would just caution that we don't present any of this information. I mean, obviously it's being presented now, but in terms of like having a town hall meeting or something like that, until we have our narrative on what we're trying to tell. Because right now, I mean, I think if we try to, even with what we talked about today, give a different version of this, I still don't even, to what end? I'm not sure that we know that yet. So until we have a little bit more clearer idea of what narrative we're trying to move forward, I'm not 100% sure how effective the staff time and energy in putting together a town hall is going to be.
Well, and I appreciate that. That's actually where convening the advisory group to be able to fine-tune some of the materials we have and to take the feedback from the advisory group to be able to think about how to sharpen the narrative that we want to have as we move forward.
I mean, I did get an end, which I was looking for, in the sense of where are we now and how are we in comparison to other like districts? And that is an end.
Right, no, and
Right.
that's fine for us, for this board and this finance committee meeting, but in terms of like actually going through the effort of doing a whole community town hall where we're trying to present, I don't think presenting this is necessarily useful.
Yeah, well, and I don't know that it would be just this, but I think the big aha is this is going to be very tough because at the highest level, we are on par or lower relative to our peer districts. So there's some, I mean, I would agree you don't want to be digging into the detail, but there is some level of a point of view of, based on this benchmarking, we aren't, well, far and above other districts that we could think that there might be some natural places to reduce. That would be my key takeaway, right?
No, but I still don't think that, this is all tough is necessarily a narrative. That a narrative is, this is tough and here's what we propose to do about it and why. And until we're prepared to do that, I'm not sure what use to just say, wow, we're in a really tough spot.
It's sort of like it's like chapter 1, tune in for the next,
Right,
episode.
but I think that it's, until we have the full, complete picture of what we are trying to do and what we think we need to do and what our goal is with all of this information, just presenting it out and putting it out there, I think it's confusing. I think it's, we are the elected officials, the administration who is charged with doing this. I think when we go to the public, it's to tell them what's going on and to tell them what we think the solutions are. I think that's what they're looking for when they come to a town hall, not just, wow, we've got a lot of issues that, and then stay tuned for how we are going to solve them.
Well, Suni, I have to say I disagree slightly in that I think that there's a stage of awareness building and educating folks on what the situation is that we haven't done everything that we probably need to do. I mean, you know as well as I do, not like the masses don't watch this. And so there might be some other avenues to build so that everybody has somewhat, before you begin to present solutions and trade-offs, we have a shared understanding of what the situation is. I think that is part of our responsibility. And that to get more valuable input on that, everybody, there has to be some kind of standard playing field. I don't know how much time and effort it's worth doing, and to your point about resources, but I think,
a general state of unintentionally perhaps, but creating fear, like, oh my God, so what does that mean? What are they going to increase class sizes? Are they going to do this? Are they going to do that? What cuts are coming next?
right.
That's where I would caution. If we just present the information out there without giving some general idea, and this is where we think we want to move forward. It's an incomplete picture, and I'm not sure that it's worth the large.
But don't you think we have some of that already when we present deficits out in, upcoming years? We present these deficit budgets, which look pretty scary.
Well, that's true.
And then people are going to make their own assumptions about, and what are they going to do about that? Look at that size of that deficit. I think we're going to have to cut, they're going to have to raise class sizes. That's what they're going to have to do.
Different, though, than saying we're convening a special town hall meeting where we're going to discuss our budgetary issues and then not actually.
Can I just jump in here? Can I jump in? Because I'd like to just respond to this. So as somebody who's just a third party observing, I think she makes a good point. I think everything has to be taken in context. I want to applaud the work. It all has to be taken in context. The first 2 questions I would ask if I saw this, 3 questions. How did you choose your peer groups? Are these districts in deficit too? And how well are their students doing? And until I know that, I don't know what this really means to me, right? I would ask those 3 questions. If they're not in deficit and they're spending $19,000 a student, good for them. They got a different tax base, they're doing something, right? If they're doing way better than us for $12,000 a student, I really want to know that because they're doing something right over there. So I'd like to know what that is. If they're doing about the same as we are and they're struggling with the same deficit issues and they're spending about the same amount of money, I might want to talk to them and strategize about what they're going to do next. But out of context, presenting this information, it could be presented as our outcome is this is for information. We told you there's a deficit. We want to make you aware of what surrounding towns are doing. But I would have a lot of questions if I was just shown this without that context. How are they doing? are they in deficit too? And what do their outcomes look like relative to ours? Because otherwise, this is a big vacuum. And I also want to point out, plus or minus 5% on these numbers is huge. Plus or minus 5% on $100 million is $5 million. That's our budget deficit problem in 2 years. So when we say we're, the big N and the little, I like the methodology. I think it's great to visually depict things, but we just have to, if we're 4% above a median number, that could be millions of dollars. So we just have to understand that too. I think this is a good general context, and if that's what we want to give the public, it could be useful, but it needs to be framed in context of a lot of other things too.
I just like, SUNY used the word narrative, which in my mind kind of is synonymous with story. And story usually has some chapters and it has sort of an arc to it and context and background. I think it's, if I'm understanding you right, it's kind of a package as we go forward that has all these component parts very thoughtfully laid out and accessible. I mean, we've taught, like, that word has come up a lot tonight about accessibility. Of, like, can people actually understand what we're talking about and understand the storyline?
And also,
And the
do
solutions.
we have the ending?
The solutions.
written
Yes,
down,
sorry,
too.
I forgot.
But
So that's,
The denouement.
I think there is a story here, though, and this is and even with the critique, because we can actually fine tune and do a lot of more deeper work. Omar, you asked me what surprised me. What surprised me is nothing tremendously stands out at one end or the other. And so that, actually, Candace, you just came back to that. That means that if you buy that argument, there are, to focus on future trade-offs, that's not going to be easy because there's nothing clear in this analysis. There may be more if we actually do some more deeper dives, et cetera. So I think it's premature to actually go send a survey out and ask people to do the types of trade-off at this stage, because we're not there yet. On the other side, I think it's a responsibility to have the conversation that goes beyond this table with folks who are interested on where we're at and where we're going, given the deficits within the district and given the stresses that we face in the state of Illinois. And if members of the community would come out and listen to that, I think that information is actually really important to share as we go down the pathway of facing what might be fairly dramatic deficits in the out years. And as we go down, if we get to that point, and indeed we face those deficits, we're going to have to make some tough choices. So I think informing people as much as we can is important, and doing it in a careful way so that we can actually tell the story of information, and we can work towards the story of solution strategies and decision making over time. So I may disagree with you a little bit, but we can reserve the right to do that.
So to that point, do you all want to move, I think we can move forward with there were a couple other pieces to the budget update. And then along with the items that we already talked about, thinking about, and you guys coming back with what's reasonable, I think the same would go for just an update on what would be the plan for, revised plan for community awareness processes.
So there's a memorandum in the package that is talking about CPI update. And Kathy, do you want to just quickly give
Sure.
the overview where we are?
Yes, so we wanted to update the board about the CPI situation. I mean, CPI has been decreasing, and it dropped 0.2% in the month of September, and we still have 3 months in the year. We all pass by gas stations every day, and the gasoline, unfortunately for us, the price of gasoline keeps going down, which means that the CPI will probably continue to slide. That CPI for 2015 will determine the growth of in our property taxes in fiscal year 17-18, and we were already projecting a deficit for that year. If you can turn to Table 1 in the packet, this is a very brief.
Page 160.
Thank you. Page 160, this is a very brief summary of potential budget threats, and actually this 1% is not even part of it, because if CPI continues to slide down, and let's say it's 1%, the district will lose approximately 1.3 million. And the hit the first year is very severe because in the spring of 2017, the district will receive 55% of the prior year extension. In the fall of 2017, the county clerk will do an adjustment, and that means not only we will lose our 800,000, but we will also lose 50%, which we already have gotten in the spring of 2017. And I realize this is a really a difficult formula that we go through every single year, but unfortunately that's what's going to happen in the fiscal year 18. In addition to potential decrease in CPI, we could face financial threats listed in first 3 points. So we have the pension cost shift, which was still included in our financial projections. I mean, this is nothing new. We had it in our financial projections. We will continue to budget for pension cost shift. What we did, we took out that amount from the bottom of the projected deficit, and it's actually illustrated in Table 2. So this amount was segregated so you can see if that legislation does not happen, what could be rolled back to the budget, basically.
So the bottom line here is that we've got the pension cost shift, we got the Senate, we got the new formula that may come in, and we have the potential for a tax freeze. And if you look at on page 160, Table 1, you can see the potential threats affecting our financial future that range in fiscal year 17 of $1.9 million up to fiscal year 20 at a maximum of $12.7 million. So again, what we're doing is, again, in the spirit of transparency, calculating out what we might be facing moving forward. We also, what Kathy was just referring to, is in our normal chart that shows the projections underneath in line 25, we show where the resources are that we've allocated within the budget lines for the pension shift if that is going to occur. It's also, quite frankly, a hedge against anything else that the state's going to do. And so we've kept those resources in there to be able to explain how we're planning ahead in case of catastrophe.
Mm-hmm. And these are not updated financial projections. This is exactly the data that was presented to you in September. We will be presenting new financial projections in February of next year when the annual CPI is available.
The other thing, I just want to go a half step back to the conversation that we had before, that I have actually sitting on my desk a proposal to do a complete deep dive into our budget by a consulting firm, and I'd have to actually go see. This is called the District Management Council, and there are probably other consulting firms. These are not inexpensive analyses. This one is
$80,000 a year for 3 years.
Yeah, so it's $80,000 for 3 years. So I gulp when I look at that. Given everything that we say, I worry a bit about spending that sort of resource on the other side if there's a way to do a deep dive to get a sense of where we're spending and to really benchmark across not only locally but across the country. That may be a good expenditure. So I'm not ready to go there yet, but I've been starting to pursue that level of analysis as well. And you know, we are doing the best we can given the capacities we have to present what we have. To go into some of the next level as suggested is we'll take an investment to yield the type of information that we really would like to use. So that's the update on both the CPI and on some of the threats that are facing us as we move forward.
Are there any questions on that? Okay. So I expect we will probably have some level of budget planning update next month as well. I don't think we had explicitly on the planning calendar, but we can circle back to where we are at that point. So if we don't have any other items on the agenda, we did have a few FYI items, so if there are any big questions there, I want to give time for that. No? Okay. The next meeting will be December 7th, and I believe we have student fees for fiscal year 17 as an action item, approval of the budget calendar. We'll be reviewing the bids for roofing and masonry, correct? And then, again, likely further conversation on budget update. I think those are the key items. So if there's nothing more to come before, no more business to come before the committee, I would say at 9:08, we are adjourned. Thank you.